Even though Roberto doesn't need to be introduced, everybody knows him. Roberto is a professor of philosophy and theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul. In 2001, he defended his doctoral PhD on the notion of knowledge in Dulcis Scotus under the supervision of Holy Felda. During the last years, he's developing and coordinating together with Culleton the project Scholastica Colonialis, the reception and development of Baroque scholastics in Latin America, 16th to 18th centuries. His talk this evening, Scotist Metaphysics in Latin American Scholasticism, Central Problems and Major Characteristics, will present some of these recent results. Thank you, Roberto, for accepting our invitation, and I think you have like 40 minutes, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Alfredo, for this beautiful introduction, and thank you so much, Professor Curry, for this wonderful lecture, and I welcome you all, of course, again. I guess will be a rhetorical remark, since I am probably the last speaker this evening, if I would say, I will be short. So I'm sorry, guys, the stuff is complicated, and I will be long. So, but anyway, Alfredo will stop me after 40, 45 minutes, and then we can have some nice discussion. The background of this lecture is the project Scholastica Colonialis. One important area of this project is metaphysics. The Jesuits wrote the largest number of metaphysical courses in Latin American scholasticism. But there is also a Scotist tradition of metaphysical works, which I have been trying to characterize in my research. Above all, we should explore some names: Jerónimo Valera in Peru, the Chilean Alfonso Briceño, and the still quite unknown Chilean Juan de Fuica. The lecture is about this quite unknown Juan de Fuica, since he knew the works by Valera and by Briceño, and wrote a cursus metaphysicus, what Valera and Briceño did not. His work can be seen as a synthesis of a century and a half Scotist metaphysics in South America. In the following exposition, I shall almost totally leave aside any information on the life and works of Joanes de Fuica, or Juan de Fuica, born 1660, in the town of La Serena, in the northern part of colonial Chile. Only recently have we had a description of the Latin manuscript by Juan de Fuica. It would appear that the original document was dictated by Fuica in the period between April 1687 and May 1689. The Commentaria Philosophica ad mentem doctori subtilissimi patris fratris Johannes Duns Scotti, kept until today in the Archivo Franciscano Histórico in Santiago de Chile, includes the only complete philosophical courses taught by an author in Chile during the colonial period. The manuscript contains several commentaries ad mentem Johannes Duns Scotti on logic, philosophy of nature, and metaphysics, which actually do not need to be understood as commentaries on Aristotle's works, since they have a methodology and organization of their own, one that is strongly guided by the works and thought of John Duns Scotus. The redaction of Fuica's Commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Metaphysicam, una cum distinctionibus, etc., was finished on December 23, 1688. The text is an exposition of metaphysics as a science of the concept of being, understood as ens reale, which in turn is from the beginning systematized as a science of transcendental concepts. In order to see this, it suffices to stress that after dealing with doubts about the object of metaphysics and its conceptual nature, Fuica examines the real being in common, its convertible passiones in general, which is unum, verum, bonum, as well as each one of the abstract transcendental properties, that is, unity, truth, and goodness, including after unity an account of the metaphysical concept of distinction. Fuica explores then the possibility of being and also the notions of actuality and existence. Up to this point, Fuika's metaphysics can be characterized as strictly transcendental, or according to this approach, as ontology. It is only after dissection that it turns in a broad sense into a categorical ontology, that is, an ontology of substance and of further categories, although considerations on the transcendentality of its first object are kept in perspective by him, namely, in his expositions on the 10 supreme genera, substance and subsistence, quantity, quality, relation, the remaining predicaments, and finally, the so-called post-predicaments. The purpose of my study lies in presenting the object of metaphysics according to Fuika, taking into consideration the kind of predication that it bears, that is, univocal predication. After that, we intend to discuss the scope of knowledge covered by the science of metaphysics, depending on its object, and therefore the kind of objective unity that metaphysical investigation can provide. As a consequence, we will offer a short exposition, and this is important, on the being of reason, and finally, a treatment of the key notion of non-contradiction, as well as its unifying potential regarding a science of the real being or of being lato sensu. The understanding that can then be obtained about the extension or objective unity of metaphysics as a science, which at some moments sways between a transcendental science, strictly speaking, ontology as theory of real being, and a super-transcendental science, will be systematized and summarized in a very short conclusion. Let's begin saying something about the object and the objective unity of metaphysics. In the preface to his Commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Metaphysicam, Fuika calls metaphysics the theoretical wisdom of the philosophers. It deals with the entire being, totum ens, which includes separate substances. Precisely because of the status of its objects, it is the noblest among the sciences that we can study by natural means. Metaphysics embraces all beings, as far as the ratio entis is found in them. In fact, it is knowledge. In its knowledge, the knowledge of God is clearly included. What is the adequate object of attribution of that theoretical science? The adequate object of metaphysics is the real being in common, about which I will talk more about in the sequence of my paper. When talking of the adequate object of a science, Fuika means the object that contains all things treated in the corresponding habit. Again, his view is one of inclusion. The science of reality is a science of reality in its entirety, or of everything that somehow falls under the ratio of the real being in common. In the next passage, Fuika asks whether being is a univocal, an equivocal, or an analogous term. Making use of what he had expounded upon already in his Sumulae Logicalis about this matter, Fuika reminds his reader that the univocal term can be taken in active and in passive meaning. An active univocal term is the term that signifies a ratio common to many, which is called univocating univocal term. A passive univocal term, which is also called univocated univocal term, is or indicates the nature which is participated by many. The definitions that Fuika offers for these kinds of signifying terms are rather traditional. Together with Aristotle, he affirms that univocal terms are those whose noun is common and the ratio of the substance, the ratio of the thing, according to that noun, is absolutely common. In fact, this definition only concerns univocated univocal terms. In any case, it is clear that univocal terms relate both to terms meaning quiddities and terms meaning accidents. Leaving aside here, for the sake of brevity, the definition of equivocal terms, Fuika defines analogous terms as those whose noun is common and the ratio of the quiddity of the substance according to that name is absolutely diverse, but it is the same in a qualified sense. An analogous term belongs in the category of equivocal terms, because the analogous term and the term equivocal by agreement are the same. You read that in handout number 3. What is meant by this is that the same noun or term may properly be imposed on things which are themselves diverse from one another due to a certain agreement which does not rule out an absolute difference. Analogy means, Cicero and Quintilian taught us, proportion and similarity or comparison of one item to another. For the sake of brevity, I just emphasize the analogy of attribution or proportion. It suffices to say that an analogous term of attribution is that one whose name is common, but the ratio of the substance is in an absolute sense diverse, and the same in a qualified sense, namely through the attribution of the items compared to one item. A much repeated example of this, as is well known, is originally to be found in Aristotle and was repeated by his medieval interpreters, is the term healthy, referring to animal, urine, and medicine, which is a very well-known example, etc., etc. This is now important. Foucault affirms that by means of analogous terms as such, it is impossible to make a separation, praecidere is the verb, of any common ratio, handout 5. The reason is that in analogous terms, the reason of agreement is not distinguished from the reason of difference, and the ratio does not rule out unequalness either. But the reason of agreement is necessarily required in order to obtain a separation in an absolute sense, a praecisio simpliciter. This is a very much coasted formulation. In order to conceptually obtain a ratio that will be in an absolute sense common to all inferior beings, so that one can accordingly know it of all real beings, that ratio has necessarily to be univocal. Although Foucault does not make any detailed exposition of that matter, he sees in the assumption of a univocal notion of being as being the only possible way that is available for the metaphysician who, with his science, wants to formulate a scientific or strict knowledge which, under certain regards, theoretically embraces every being. It will be in question 3 of distinction 1 of his Commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Metaphysicum that Foucault will defend the thesis that the real being is treated in first philosophy as a common objective concept, therefore as the immediate objective term of the human intellect in what regards the science of reality. The common objective concept of the real being is therefore univocally abstracted or abstractively separated, that is, praecisum, of God, creatures, substance, and accident. He reproduces the idea that for several doctors there is in fact a formal concept of being, the intellectual act which has as the term of its act itself the concept, which in reality is completely different from the formal concepts of particular beings, so that the intellectual act or the formal concept that clearly and distinctly represents being is distinguished from the act of the intellect or the formal concept that clearly and distinctly represents substance. We can offer proof of this through a mental experiment. The same concept cannot be evident and obscure, and it can be the case that a thing is conceived with evidence under the common reason of being, and is conceived with obscurity insofar as the concept says a part of being, a substantial one, an accidental one, which one. Through the intellect, thus, it is known with evidence what is the real being, and there is a doubt whether it is substance, accident, or whatever. From this intellectual performance of actualizing formal concepts of the most diverse things, Foucault sees that a question can be raised whether there is a univocal objective concept of being, which as represented thing is abstractively obtained from all real formally conceived items and validly predicated of them, that is God, substance, and accidents. We would expect that the premise according to which God, creature, substance, accidents, etc. agree in the ratio of being demands some proof. Handout number 6. In the proof offered by Fuika, we read that several diverse items agree absolutely in some ratio in which they participate according to the same, this is important, essential definition. Our author would concede, as we will soon see, that this agreement in some ratio, this is very important, can be according to the same relative essential definition. It seems that we can assume that God, creature, substance, and accident participate in the ratio entes according to the same essential definition, because it is correct to say of each of them that they do not have any repugnance to real existence. And this is exactly the essential definition of being, or so we can affirm the entire essential definition of being, or sure we can affirm this is the entire definition, essential definition of being that Fuika endorses. Again, not having any repugnance to real existence. But we need to know more about this real being in common, which is the object of metaphysics. In the entire first distinction of his commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Metaphysicam, Fuika deals with the real being in common, the concept of being, which is the first object of metaphysics. What is and how many kinds of real beings are there? As a presupposition, Fuika first affirms that being can be understood according to two aspects: as a participle, participialiter, and as a name, nominaliter. As a participle, being is considered insofar as it is the participle of the substantive verb esse, and so it means actual existence, handout number 7, or the act of existing. As a name, being means the essence or the quiddity of the thing insofar as it is separated from the act of existence. He insists upon saying that this is a way of considering being, but it is not a division of being in nominal and participial being, if that means two members which are divided in terms of mutual opposition. After all, nominal being, which means the quiddity of the thing, is separated from existence, but it is not excluded. The procedure in question is not division, but rather separation, which is itself, as distinction as such will be, indeed, not a negation of one item regarding the other. Fuika defines the separation at issue, which is certainly done by the intellect, between, again, participial and nominal aspect of being, as a consideration alone of one without the other, in which one member, nominal being, is the divided item, and the other member, participial being, is the dividing one. It should be stressed, however, that the nominal being is not only divided in participial, which means the same as actual being or existing being. There is something important here. It contains as its second dividing item the possible being, which Fuika also calls being in potency. Most exactly thus, we can affirm that the quiditative being, the nominal aspect of being, is separated in actual being and possible being. Handout number 8 is important now. In a second presupposition, Fuika proposes a division of definitions, or rather, a division of definitions that explain the essence of the thing, that is, essential definitions. There is an absolute definition which is provided by rationes in absolute terms, such as a human being is a rational animal, and there is, this is important, a relative definition which is provided by terms which are ordered or which have an order to one another, as for example, father is the relative item or the generator of the sun. What Fuika is trying to do with this division of definitions is to determine the nature of real being. On the one hand, being does not possess any essential definition in the way of an absolute definition, since it would, in that case, contain terms of genre and difference. And it is well known, being is a maximally simple and abstract concept. There is no predicate which is beyond or higher than it and is still common to it and other terms. On the other hand, however, being can be essentially explained. Through its most excellent definition, this is really important for Fuika, namely the essentially relative definition in an order to existence. This is the definition. Being is that to which real existence does not contradict. A definition which can effectively be extracted from the works of Scotus. The proof of this last claim consists in arguing that the first aspect which is known of being is that it does not contradict it existing. If the first aspect, handouts 9, 10, and 11, if the first aspect of the intellection of what something is essential to this something, then we can conclude that non-repugnance is essential to being. The Chilean master even refines his notion that no stricto sensu essential definition of being can be provided when he affirms that being is definable descriptive through a description, through its attributes and properties, in which case we could affirm that being is that in which there is truth, goodness, and unity. Further on, handouts 10 and 11, Fuika will insist in affirming that one, true, and good are not divisions of being, but rather something like its properties, which are just enumerated. They express the essential content of being, but they do not divide it. Again, if those properties are not divisions of being, they cannot essentially define it either. The discussion about the essentially relative definition of being has enormous significance for Fuika's metaphysical project, since he will find there room for new ideas concerning the analysis of the object of metaphysics. In any case, this relative definition was much discussed by Fuika, reacting to several objections which I cannot discuss right now. Let's say now something about real being, but also something about being of reason. Having been found a relative essential definition of being, which should help make precise what is the object of metaphysics as general and fundamental science of reality, Fuika believes that it is important to ask whether there is, for the given definition, a ratio communis between real being and being of reason. The answer to this question will prove both complex and able to bring a philosophically innovating solution. In what follows, we have an account which distinguishes being, real being, and being of reason. It is helpful, thus, to offer here a set of definitions of real being and being of reason. These definitions, however, are not treated together in the clearest way in the Commentaria in Universum Metaphysicam themselves, but rather in Fuika's Commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Logicam, where the Chilean master disserts in the second distinction on the object of logic, inquiring in the third question whether the formal object of logic is a real being or a being of reason. Let's say something about the formal object of logic. Doubtless, Fuika will say that the formal object of logic is a certain being of reason, but for that purpose he needs to define being of reason and real being again. In the first moment, thus, the being of reason is the chimerical being, which has no being but objectively in the intellect, such as horsemen, whereas the real being is the one which has true being from the part of the thing, such as man. After these short definitions, pay attention to handout 14 and 15, After these short definitions, Fuika affirms that one can find, concerning the object of logic, first, the position of the Thomists, which is, in his view, followed by, in Peru, by Jerónimo Valera, in Chile by Alfonso Briceño, and, so he says, the most illustrious Umansoro, another Peruvian Franciscan author, Scotist author, according to which the formal object of logic is the or a being of reason. A second opinion advocates that the formal object of logic is the extrinsic denomination. A third view, which Fuika, differing from his Peruvian Chilean masters, considers the correct one, proposes that the formal object of logic is the real being intrinsic in the acts of the intellect. This view is defended by John Punch, Thenodius, an author I could not identify, and again Fuika, and other most intelligent Scotists. Quotation number 15, handout 15, sorry. For Fuika, the proof of this point is that the formal object of logic is this is now very complicated, this is new language. The formal object of logic is the passive directability, or the direction in the first act, in which the dirigibilitas, the directability, is something real and intrinsic in the acts of the intellect. Therefore, because this passive directability is the object of logic, one can conclude that the object of logic is a real being. The Chilean master defends the minor premise by affirming, handouts 15 and 16, that this passive directability, or the direction in the first act, is really undistinguished from the entity itself of the acts of the intellect. Since the entity of the acts of the intellect is a real being, at least in a sense, we conclude that the passive directability is a real being too. In fact, Fuika defines the aforementioned passive directability, or still the referred direction in the first act, as to rightly and orderly represent the thing, that is, to represent it in a certain way, taliter, or according to the definition or division. Since to represent rightly and orderly the thing is something intrinsic and real in the acts of the intellect, therefore the directability is so too. It is not possible to explain in detail here the intriguing thesis about the formal object of logic. What is certain is that the formal object of logic for Fuika is not the being of reason, or even a being of reason, at least if one takes being of reason in a strict sense. Of course, Fuika takes into consideration the scientific study in logic of objects whose status of objectivity, at least partially, depends on the mind. He is aware of the fact that for many, logic seems to deal with alleged beings of reason, such as subject, predicate, proposition, syllogism, etc. In this regard, we should affirm that, handout 17, there are beings of reason, broadly speaking, large, like those just mentioned, and beings of reason chimerically. And the last ones are not beings of reason, such as subject, predicate, etc. Logic, according to Fuika, deals with the being of reason broadly, not strictly taken, handout 17. It is also important to bear in mind that Fuika will affirm that the object of attribution of logic, that is, the one under which all aspects of logical knowledge fall, is the mode of knowing, modus sciendi, which comprises and unifies everything logic deals with. Truly, the question whether this is a real being or a being of reason is a meta-discourse, that is a part of a meta-logic. In his own account, Fuika once again diverges from the mainstream interpretation of the Scotist authors, according to which the first object of attribution of logic is the syllogism. Nonetheless, he claims to have, 18 and 19 in the handout, he claims to have in favor of his position the support of a good number of interpreters of Scotus. In particular, Scotus himself apparently had said in question 4 of Book 1 of his supposed questions on Aristotle's First Analytics, which we know today it is a spurious work, that the instrument of knowing is the subjectum of the entire logic. It is common to all things which are considered in logic, and puts an objective limit on it. But since this study, my presentation now, does not strictly concern the object of logic, but it is rather about the object of metaphysics, which according to a given essentially relative definition, I will come back to this, seems to be common to what metaphysics is concerned with, and to what logic investigates as its adequate object, where this last one, in a given respect, a being of reason, is a being of reason. We still have to explore more the idea of being of reason in Fuika's Commentaria on Logics. Let me say still something important. At any rate, Foucault assumes that the investigation into the being of reason, this is really interesting, belongs to metaphysics and not to logic. However, logical objects seems to be beings of reason. Therefore, it is useful to examine their existence and their essence in works and logic. The Chilean master now affirms that the being of reason can be understood in several ways. 1. Initially, it embraces those things which possess subjective being or effective being in the intellect, where the first, subjective being, is what is received and subsists in the intellect, for example, an intellectual habit. And the second, effective being, is what has being in the intellect in the sense of being produced by the intellect through a physical or effective influx, the act itself of the intellect, or still through a directive influx, artificial things which find direction through the intellect. It is important to bear in mind that although Foucault throughout his entire manuscript makes use of the expression beings of reason for all such things, these beings which have subjective being or effective being are for him real beings, ente realia. Only improperly are they called beings of reason, namely because they inhere in a given intellect. Second, the being of reason is most properly understood when we consider it as that which in no way is real being, that is, which does not have and cannot have any being or existence a parte re. After having made the division of beings of reason in beings of reason improperly and properly, the chimerical ones, our author offers a definition of being of reason, which is also useful for his thesis that there are beings of reason. That is, what has objective being in the intellect alone? This is the definition, the general one. Again, this definition seems to be valid for both classes of being of reason, and Foucault reviews his conviction that this definition is taken from Scotus, namely from Scotus Quod Libet question 3, where the pseudo doctor had given the following definition for the being of reason, the general definition: what has been precisely in the intellect that considers, or that is reflecting on something in the mind, or that is actualizing a mental content. Precisely at this point, however, the Chilean master introduces a note which explains why, in spite of the expression being of reason, which indicates the objective esse in the intellect alone, beings of reason can be, notwithstanding that restricted domain of existence, handout 21, real or non-real. It is important to pay attention, therefore, to the idea of having objective being. The objective being in the intellect can be, according to Foucault, of two kinds. Handout 21 is important now. 1. What has objective being in the intellect can have another being from the part of the thing. And in this case, this objective being, truly also called by Foucault being of reason for existing only in the intellect, will be real being. As an example, he mentions the form or the nature human being, homo, insofar as it is object of cognition. Well, human being insofar as it is cognized is a being of reason because it has only objective being in the intellect, but it is a real being because it has another real being in reality itself. Second, what has objective being in the intellect can be such that it does not have another being from the part of the thing, and in this case this objective being will be properly being of reason, bringing here, as an example, impossible things such as horseman or golden mountain. In these items, the entire being of the being of reason, as it is distinguished from the real being, has merely objective being in the intellect. The common aspect among all beings which being own, so that their being in this regard and on the of the intellect, the origin of such a being in the real being, or else the non-origin of such a being in the real being, eventually comes to divide the ens rationis itself. In coherence with this, further on in text, Foucault straightforwardly divides the being of reason in chimerical and non-chimerical, but you already got the point. We don't have to repeat this here. I still need to make a further consideration about real being, and then I will come to my decisive point about the relationship between metaphysics and logic. I still need to explain and to say something about a further double consideration of the real being that Foucault wants to make. Returning now to the course of the exposition based on the first questions of distinction 1 of Foucault's Commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Metaphysicam, it is important to emphasize that any answer to the question on the objective integration between real being and being of reason presupposes the initial assumption that proper real being can be approached in a double way. This is now a new move in the argument. First, insofar as it is actual and has actual existence. Second, insofar as it is possible alone. In the second status, Foucault affirms that the possible real being means two things. In handout 24. In recto, in another, in obliquo. Our author apparently wants to say that real being insofar as it is possible means in recto a certain non-repugnance, and a real being insofar as it is possible in obliquo connotates real existence, means or signifies together real existence. Up to this point, we have affirmations on the real being based on two considerations which had already been admitted before. Foucault says something similar about the being of reason, which is considered also in a double way. First, insofar as it is the being of reason which is actual or has actual objective existence. Second, insofar as the being of reason is possible alone, handout 25. In the second status, being of reason means two things too, one in recto and another in obliquo. Being of reason insofar as it is possible means in recto, this is important, a certain non-repugnance. Being of reason insofar as it is possible means in obliquo, connotatively, signifying a further thing, that is, its meaning is just a certain objective existence in the intellect. Having established thus a relative essential definition of being, and now the double consideration of the real being and of the being of reason, Foucault, in the next step, affirms that, speaking in absolute terms, being is not univocal to real being and to being of reason, as John Duns Scotus taught in Ordinatio 1, distinction 26. After all, the ratio, which is univocally separated or completely abstracted, must be equally participated by all items or terms which are at issue. It happens, however, that the ens actuale, the actual being, taken by the Chilean master as the absolute being, is differently participated by the real being, which is the object of metaphysics, and by the being of reason, which is object of another science. What is the explanation for this? Foucault affirms that the real being is truly and simply being, and the being of reason is being only metaphorically and in a qualified sense, since it is rather or more non-being than being. The being of reason is closer to the non-being, what seems to amount here to the thesis that the being of reason cannot exist effectively. Because of these differences, Foucault, handout 26, does not hesitate in saying that the actual being, implicitly taken in this part of his expositions, as the most basic and absolute meaning of being or entity, must be rather classified as analogous or still equivocal through agreement in comparison to real being and being of reason. However, and now is the new move, precisely at this point it is appropriate to remember that both the real being and the real being include, according to Foucault, the notion of possible. Both are, in a sense, possibilia. And if they are so considered, in this case, it is possible to abstract from them a reason of being ratio entis which is univocal and common. In a handout 27 and 28 now, in a remarkably interesting passage, Fuika claims that he only found in favor of this solution to the question about the community of being between real and of reason one single author, a certain Peruvian and very much learned Scotist. Perhaps a guy called, where is my remark? Perhaps a guy called Gonzalo, which is in some other passages mentioned by him, but we don't know which is this author. In order to prove the above thesis on the univocity of being, between metaphysics, logic, Fuika affirms that the possibility lies in the reason of non-repugnance, and exactly in that ratio real being and being of reason have conceptual agreement. That is, real being and being of reason are equally non-repugnant or non-contradictory. Therefore, the reason of possible being is univocal regarding the real being and the being of reason. In order to give support to the major premise, he brings this thread definition or definition in recto of possible, which means only possible means only a certain non-repugnance, or even more simply, unconditional non-contradictoriness of a given content. In a similar way, Fuika seems to take as a primitive truth, namely both real and eternal, the non-repugnance of the being of reason, such as subject, predicate, syllogism, and the non-repugnance of the real being, such as man, horse, tree, stone, etc. Certainly Fuika speaks here of what he had understood in his commentaria in Universum Aristotelis Logicam as being of reason in an improper sense, that is, the non-chimerical being of reason which possesses real objective being. Moreover, it is important to bear in mind that the idea of non-repugnance is explicitly evident in the relative essential definition of real being as the object of metaphysics, that which does not contradict to exist. It appears in the definition of improper being of reason too, since both contain in their definitions possible being or the possible, that is, the not having any repugnance. I'm finishing. One might expect that doubts regarding this solution would immediately emerge, and the most obvious one would be to question whether the possibility at issue really is each time the same, or has in fact the same identity and meaning. After all, the possibility of a being of reason, such as, for example, syllogism, does not seem to be real, but rather to depend on the intellect for its existence. Therefore, there would be the real possibility independent of any intellect and the possibility of reason dependent on some intellect. That will then implode the desired univocity of the possible being previously sketched. Fuika, however, handout 29, insists that this is not the case. The possibility of the being of reason depends on the intellect only regarding the connotated items, the connotata, which are meant in obliquo, this co-signification of existence. For example, a given being which is only possible as the act of an intellectual mind, but this does not entail the conclusion. A given being which is only possible as the act of an intellectual mind. But this does not entail the conclusion that the possibility itself of the being of reason depends on the intellect regarding the non-repugnance, which it means in recto. In an analogous example, he affirms that this thesis on non-repugnance is manifest about any possible real being, although it depends on God regarding the connotation, that is the existence. Its meaning in obliquo apparently is a given real item that can exist in the effective world and exist only in the divine mind, but its existence does not depend on God's intellect regarding the non-repugnance. the non-repugnance is objectively given in possible real beings and in possible beings of reason. In any case, it is understandable that even if one accepts the thesis that there is this univocal possibility, separated or abstracted in an ultimate sense from the possible real being and the possible being of reason, where possibility as non-repugnance appears in the definition of the real being, one can demand more explanations for the common aspect of this ens possibile, which should stay between the real and the non-real. Foucault discusses several objections which we cannot pursue here. Just to sum up, something that characterizes Scotist metaphysics in Latin America is always an attempt for systematic approaches. We find in Latin American scholasticism, as we already found in 15th century European Scotism, the attempt for systematizing something like a Scotist logic, a Scotist metaphysics, a Scotist philosophy of nature. We see in Latin American Scotism a loyalty to the Scotist sources, the use of Scotist commentators, the debate among them, the attempt for setting differences regarding and towards Thomistic Jesuit thought and thinkers. Very important, metaphysics in this philosophical courses taught by Foucault is explicitly understood and presented as a transcendental science. Everything about substance or the finite being has, in a sense, a secondary significance. Also very important, in many regards, the metaphysics of substance, even though it belongs to the cursus metaphysicus, was very much dealt with in the courses on philosophy of nature, since substance is the composition between matter and form. Metaphysics for Scotism in Latin America is the science of transcendentals. The interest on the being of reason. Why? It is remarkable. All authors, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, Scotists, non-Scotists, they wrote enormously about the being of reason. In many cases, they even actually treat the topic between logic and metaphysics, real being and being of reason, in the course on logics, and actually do not repeat that point in a metaphysical course. Why the interest on the being of reason was so huge? Well, probably because logic is, to a good extent, the form of thought which conditions thought, and thus also representation or simply knowledge claims of things. To secure the link between logic and metaphysics is to secure claims on reality as they are made possible in the operations of the mind. And it seems that since the link between logic and metaphysics is so important, and actually also important to have something like a claim that we really can thought of reality, it seems to be a very important claim that if being of reason says something about the structure of thought, it seems to be important that the structure of thought is essentially non-repugnant, non-contradictory. Well, we have to think more about why the being of reason was so important in these courses on metaphysics. It belongs to metaphysics in Latin American scholasticism anyway. Many thanks for your attention and your patience.
So the floor is open. Question? Okay. Rodrigo, please.
Thanks, Roberto. Really, very short question, because I think we we need, and this is very strange, we need to accept in order to comprehend what he's doing, the distinction between to be real and to be rational as not being exhaustive. Because, yeah, and otherwise we could, what do you think is the best move? And to consider that for him, the distinction between real and rational is not exhaustive, and then you have a third realm that would belong to the univocal, to the possibility, or in fact, we would stick to the fact that the distinction is indeed exhaustive, but in this case, this ratio entis univoca should be a kind of rational again. It should be a kind of ens rationis again, and then we will drop back to the idea that okay, there is indeed a kind of univocal concept, but this concept is a rational one. It's not being in as real.
Yeah. Going back and going back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Rodrigo, it's a good question. It's an excellent question, I would say. There are many particularities in Fuika's text, and he presupposes a lot. Before saying something about your question, is this distinction real and of reason, exhaustive or not? I think it is not. I think it is not. I think it's really important to remember that among so many concepts and ideas, we should remember he insists on this Scotist point of view. Being, the real being, again, real being is very much a Suarezzian formulation, which is fully consistent with Scotism, but in the 17th century, all Scotists use this expression without any troubles. It's important to have again in mind that being has this nominal aspect. It says the thing what it is, quiddity. Being, entity is about quiddity, it's about what it is. And it has the participial aspect, which says actual existence, but also possible existence. This is really important. It seems to be a coherent way to decipher the definition that being is that does not contradict to exist. Or being is that can always exist. This is important. But actually now the other set of concepts, real and of reason. It is in many regards quite curious what Fuika does with real when he connects real to being of reason. Actually, he would say beings of reason are have always objective esse, in the sense that what is common to all beings of reason is that they have an existence dependent on a given intellect. But of course, when he says that in a sense we can say that some beings of reason are entia realia, actually he just wants to capture a link. In which sense? In a sense that, in a certain sense, the beings of reason that exist in us, objectively, are not fictions, strictly speaking, or chimeras, strictly speaking. There must be a link with the extra-mental world, with the affectivity, or with Wirklichkeit, to use Meinung's good expression in that regard. But anyway, regarding actual existence, beings of reason have always something to do with the objective being in intellect, and real beings have always something to do with existence in the extra-mental world. So, regarding actual existence, they cannot be univocal. So, only an analogy there is there. But structurally, structurally real being is nominal, participial, and when participial, actual existence and possible existence. And there is possibility there. And structurally, possible being is that can have existence in the intellect. In a sense, there is possibility there. This is what he wants, in a sense, to capture, to put this connection between both worlds, let's say so. If there is something like, so we would say, if there is something like super transcendental metaphysics, which is interestingly enough a word that he doesn't use. Actually, the word super transcendental is really very rare in all manuscripts I have been researching. I found, for example, the word super transcendental in the Sumulae Dialecticae by Valera, but he was very much repeating the use of the word by Domingo de Soto, just giving different examples. What I mean is that we certainly realize that they are, in a sense, trying to understand how this super transcendental science will be possible. In two moments, perhaps in two moments we are, in a sense, challenged to see the link, because Fuika mentions this: real, of reason, and ens possibile, possibility. Well, there is some link here, must be some link here, because the possibility of real things and the possibility of things of reason are independent of any mind. Only the connotation of existence depends on the mind of God or on any given mind. So in a sense, there must be some link between real and of reason in this ens possibile, because the basic meaning of this ens possibile is non-repugnance. And this is but then we can, of course, put the question, but can we say more, in the sense that in which aspect there is this common aspect? So between real and of reason there is possibility. I'm not sure whether Fuika does that move, but we could put this interpretation. In a very explicit passage, he actually says ens reale, ens rationis, and ens actuale, which is curious, because in some cases he actually equals ens actuale with ens absolutum. We should remember that if we construct something like a transcendental metaphysics, there is one dissertation in this course which is about actualitas and which is about possibilitas. In some aspects, it seems to consider that actuality is above reality and of reason. Probably he is thinking about some possible notions which are above reality and of reason, which will be something like objective reality. And I think one clear link is possibility, but perhaps there is something like a higher level of actuality. The two links, I think, will be, let's think about actualitas et possibilitas, which seems to be above realitas and esse objective in a given mind. I think this is the link, but I have to do more work about that, because I should try, in a sense, to analyze his dissertations about modalities. All the Scotist discourse about modalities, you know that, was turned to be very much complicated in the Scotist tradition. When Scotist authors in the second, well, in the first generation after Scotus, in a sense, attempt to prove are there higher order modalities, let's say so. I think the first Scotist who realized how complex that could be was Francis of Myronis. And so the point will really be in this case, fine, since we don't have something like a nominal aspect which is common, is there something like a modal aspect which is common? I'm sure possibilitas has to be there, but perhaps there is a higher order aspect of actualitas. Because let's remember that non-repugnance is something objective, irrespective of a being or reason, irrespective of a being, a real being. Then there is something like an actualitas also for both of them. I think we have to go in this direction.
It's already 8:30, so it's time to thank again our speakers and then come back tomorrow.